Hello and welcome to the revision lecture for MN7702. Hi, this is Steve Conway. We met a few weeks ago on the innovation modules. Okay, so what I want to do this morning is to give you a little bit of an overview of the exam format for the exam in 2-3 weeks' time, and also give you a overview of the sort of key areas that you might want to look at prior to the exam in the innovation area. So I'm going to primarily be looking at units 2 to 4 relating to innovation, and then Nicola will be doing a separate short presentation on the operations management units, so units 5, 6 and 7. Okay, so I'll just go over the sort of format of the exam. It's very similar to the exam you did for MN7701 6 months ago, 5-6 months ago, except for that there is a slightly different number of questions. So for this exam, there's going to be 4 questions. 2 of those questions will be on the innovation units, and 2 will be on the operations management units. So the 4 questions in total, 2 on the areas that I will be talking about today, and 2 from the operations management areas. You must answer all 4 questions. Each question has a word limit of 750 words. I think that might differ slightly from the previous exam you did for Olga and Warren, because I think you had slightly different number of questions. But in this particular exam, 4 questions, each with a limit of 750 words. And of course there's the usual plus or minus 10% on that. You're more likely to, I guess, use the plus 10% than the minus 10%, I suspect. That word limit doesn't include the references at the end. Now, as last time, the format that you actually write in is more like an assignment, to be honest, because we'd expect you to reference in the assignment, and then at the end, reference within each question, and at the end of each question put a list of references. You could put all of your references at the very end, but I think it would probably work after each question to put the references that you've used in that particular question. So question, answer for that question followed by the references for that answer, and do that for all 4 questions. As for the previous exam you did with MN7701, it's an open book exam, which means you can look at various materials from the library, from books you have, from the materials that we've given you, but you are not allowed to collaborate and communicate with others, in particular those on the course or those who have done the module before. So it is meant to be your own work as per an exam, but you are allowed to use materials from books and journal articles and materials that we've given you. The exam paper, as per last time, along with the instructions, will be sent to you by the Distance Learning Office. I think Karen normally sends that. So you'll be getting the exam through your email on the morning of the exam. I suspect at the moment it starts. And there will be some additional instructions there. As last time, the paper will include all the instructions that I'm talking about now, plus the 4 questions that Nicola and I would like you to answer. The exam will fall from Friday the 17th of July until Monday the 20th of July. It starts at 9 o'clock on the Friday the 17th of July, UK time, which currently is GMT +1, and should still be for the rest of the summer now. We're now in British summer time, which is GMT +1, Greenwich Mean Time +1. And the exam will finish at 9 o'clock GMT UK time on the Monday the 20th of July, and you need to submit via Blackboard. Again, the instructions will come with the exam paper that the Distance Learning Office will send. You need to submit via Blackboard as you did last time with the MN7701 paper. by the 9 o'clock deadline. So you'll have 3 full days to do the paper. As per last time, you will have an option and a possibility of posting queries relating to the exam paper on Blackboard. Again, details will be provided by Karen from the Distance Learning Office. And basically Nicola and I will be on Blackboard checking for queries between 9 o'clock in the morning and 7 o'clock in the evening on that Friday. And those queries we can answer are not related to the content of your answers, the content of and how you might respond to the questions, but those should be around the I guess questions relating to pertaining to the wording of the questions themselves. So we can't give you guidance on the content, but we can give you guidance if you have queries about the format or the question wording. I believe last time most of the questions we had were in advance of the exam, and on the day I don't know if we had any at all actually, but either way Nicola and I will be checking for that first day and giving answers where appropriate. Okay, so that's the format. What I want to do now is just give you a brief overview of the sorts of materials that you might want to look at in advance of the exam paper linked to the 3 units on innovation. Now I'm not going to go into the content of these various topics, but I just want to direct you towards the material and just give you a flavour for the sorts of things you might find useful to look at. So in terms of those topics then, what I thought might be useful today would be to look at these 7 areas. So the first one is the linear versus interactive models of innovation. I cover this in the lecture in Unit 2, but I think if you look at the materials for Unit 1, I've also included some text there relating to those models. So if you look at the online materials for Unit 1, you'll see some material I've written on the linear versus interactive models, but I also cover it in Lecture 2. I'll also be looking briefly this morning at the time to market concept, the organic versus mechanistic modes of organizing framework, the concept of the ambidextrous organization, which is often linked to the organic versus mechanistic modes of organizing, but doesn't necessarily have to. The innovation process, the notion of users being involved in the innovation process, and the open versus closed innovation. Now this is not covering everything we've done in these 3 units on innovation, but it's just to help you narrow down your revision. So you can expect the exam questions to fall within the areas that I'm talking about this morning. Okay. I think perhaps one last thing to mention at this point is that there won't be any questions on the broader topic that we talked about in Unit 1, which is the glue that links operations management, marketing and innovation together, which is the idea of the value creation. So although we looked at value creation in that first unit, that first week of the module, which seems a long time ago now, almost 4 months, there won't be any direct questions relating to that material. It might be that you feel appropriate to bring in some of those notions in one of the 2 of the other questions, but there's no question specifically on value creation in that first unit. Okay, so as I said, I'm going to look at these 7 areas. I don't intend to go through all the detail that I've got here because I've got a lot of slides, but I just want to show you some of the material that you might want to look at. All of the slides that I'm going to show you are all from the lectures that I gave in Units 2, 3 and 4. And all of the slides are taken from PowerPoint slides or the PDF versions of those that are on the web. on the Blackboard site that you can look at if you wish. Okay, so I think the first thing to look at then is this idea of the linear versus interactive models of innovation. So in the very first unit, I referred to different drivers to the innovation process. One was the idea of innovation being driven by a push from either science or technology. So this is the science or technology push model. And this is the idea that basic science or technology leads to the development and ultimately to the manufacture of products and to their marketing. Now this is called a linear model because it's a series of steps from the creation of new science or technology to new products, their manufacture and marketing. Now this model, the linear model, came out, I guess, in the 1960s, but it was one that many countries were using prior to that. During the 1970s and in particular the 1980s, what we see is that companies are increasingly directing their innovation efforts by looking to the market, seeing what the market wants, and driving the innovation process by need. So what we see in the 1980s is a shift to a different kind of linear model of innovation, a linear model which is about driving the process by market need. So market needs leading to product development, manufacture, and ultimately sales. So these are two linear models of the innovation process. And I subsequently went on to talk about in the lecture 2, but also in the materials for Unit 1, the interactive model. Because what we see in the 1990s onwards is that innovative companies actually try to combine these two linear models. So rather than being technology or science push driven, or rather than just simply being pulled by the marketplace, driven by the marketplace, successful innovative companies try to bring these two models together. So innovative companies are both being driven by trying to combine the new and emerging needs of society and the marketplace and linking those to new and emerging technologies and science. And because it's trying to bring these two linear models together, it's often called the interactive model because it's interacting between emerging needs in society and emerging technological and scientific techniques. Or it's sometimes called the coupling model because it's coupling those two models. So that's the first area that you might want to look at. Linear models versus the interactive model. The second area that you might want to look at in the innovation units is the idea of timing to market innovation strategies. And if you remember, the timing to market innovation strategies is about the timing that a company has getting to a market with a new innovation, whether it's a product or service, for example, the timing it gets to the market vis-a-vis the competition. So it's not how long it takes to get to the market, it's about the timing of its product or service innovation launches vis-a-vis their competitors. And there's a whole series of different typologies that academics have used to talk about these different innovation strategies. Perhaps the most simplistic is the Porter that distinguished between leadership and followership. But in this particular unit, Unit 2, I talk more really about and take my lead from the work by Medic and Patch, who distinguishes between first to market, i.e. the company gets to an innovation first with their product or service, a second to market, which is often referred to as a fast follower, late to market. Those are the three kind of key innovation strategies that you might want to look at. But there's also the market segmentation, where you almost try to sidestep the core market by looking at new market segments. So that's something that you might want to look at. One thing to consider when you're looking at timing to market strategies is not just what a company is doing, but what enables them to do it. Because it's not simply that a company can choose to be first to market. In the lecture I talked a bit about what resources and what modes of organizing might a company need to allow it to be first to market or a late to market company. So for example, a first to market company needs certain competencies, certain resources. For example, it needs to be good at opening up primary markets, understanding new market needs, as well as having very strong knowledge development and innovation development capabilities. And because, as we've talked about before, and we'll talk about in a few minutes, innovative companies and those focused on innovation need to be more organic, you'll find that these sorts of companies need to have a more organic structure, more organic mode of organizing. And this contrasts to later market companies who are typically more focused on efficiency, cost reduction, and are therefore more likely to have a mechanistic structure. And they will have different skills. They will be less focused on innovation in product and service, and more likely to be focused on innovation in process, but also into large-scale production, and essentially they will have a different set of skills. So when we think about time-to-market strategies, it's not just about what time-to-market strategy a company aspires to, it's what kind of skills and resources and modes of organizing that you need to be able to undertake that strategy successfully, and seeing whether a company has a match between those required skills and resources and the skills and resources within the organization. And in the lecture I talked about various examples of first and second to market, and there's some material I talked about linking about which was the best. And what we found was actually, although this is quite an old study now, it found that many companies that are followers, fast followers, end up leading the market, end up being most successful. And those that often get to the market first often end up not being the most successful. So the example, I'm sure you can think of examples where companies have got there first and been successful. eBay might be a good example, iTunes, and those companies have got there second, like Google, who got this after Yahoo, but nevertheless is much more successful now than Yahoo, or a slightly later Bing, who came to the market. So I'm sure you can think of examples of first and second to market. The evidence seems to suggest that second to market or fast followers seem to be more successful in the longer term. And one of the things that is worth considering is, and I won't go through all these aspects now, but you may look at from the lecture, is why would a company choose a first to market or a fast follower? And in the lecture I talked a little bit about the advantages of a first to market and the disadvantages of a first to market. And in a way, actually, the disadvantages of the first to market are often linked to the advantages of being a fast follower. So, for example, a fast follower can free ride, which is clearly a disadvantage to a first to market. A second to market or fast follower can also learn from the mistakes which inevitably happen from a first to market company as they try to make sense of the users and the marketplace and regulation, etc. So you might want to have a look at those, the advantages and disadvantages of a first-to-market strategy, and think about the advantages and disadvantages of a fast follower or a late-to-market strategy. A third area I wanted just to direct you to is the framework of Burns and Stalker, which is the organic versus mechanistic modes of organizing, which was in Unit 3. And again, I won't go through this detail, but you might recall, and you can go off and look at the detail in the lecture and the materials. Mechanistic organizations are those that are quite hierarchical and focus on trying to control the organization. And organic organizations are those that are much more fluid, much less hierarchical. Communication tends to be much more lateral, and there tends to be a distribution of knowledge and power within the organization. And during the lecture I talked a bit about these characteristics, and so there's a series of characteristics in which you can use to distinguish between a mechanistic and organic mode of organizing. And one of the things we talked about, whether one of these modes was better than the other. And actually what we talked about is that it's not that organic is better than mechanistic, but that the organic mode is better for certain types of contexts or certain types of activities. So what you'll find is that the organic mode of organizing is better for innovation and better in more more dynamic environments subject to change. Whereas the mechanistic mode actually is better for efficiency. It's better for cost reduction. And so what we see is that stable markets where competition is more around cost rather than innovation, mechanistic modes are actually better for efficiency, effectiveness, cost reduction, etc., because you can control the activities of the organization. So organic, better for innovation and dynamic markets; mechanistic, better for cost reduction, competition based on cost, and more stable environments. And in the lecture I talked about actually this isn't a dichotomy between being organic and mechanistic. Actually what you find is that companies, depending on these different characteristics, will be more or less organic, and it's better to think about this as a spectrum rather than a dichotomy between one or the other. And in the tutorial with Roying, you would have looked at the Valve Corporation. The Valve Corporation is quite interesting because it's unusual in the fact that it's a very extreme example of the organic mode of organizing, and complete contrast to perhaps a military organization that is much more towards the mechanistic side of. And in fact, many organizations, even those that purport to be quite organic, like Google, will fall somewhere between the extremes of a pure organic and a pure mechanistic. So as soon as companies become larger, they need to bring in some of the mechanistic side of organizing just to help coordinate the activities of the organization. And this will probably happen to Valve as it grows, actually, because it's a relatively small organization at the moment. But Valve is a very interesting organic organization, and you might want to compare or contrast that with your own organization. Fourth topic I wanted to raise was relating to the ambidextrous organization. And in the lecture I used this in particular to refer to organizations that were capable of operating either simultaneously or shifting between the organic and the mechanistic modes of organizing. And so there's two forms of ambidextrous. The sequential ambidexterity, which is about changing over time. So you move from organic to mechanistic to organic over time, and that might happen at the micro level within within the innovation process. So you might start with the idea creation process that's quite organic, and as you go through the innovation process, you become more mechanistic as you make decisions about the innovation and then ultimately lead to the implementation of that. So you have this sequential ambidexterity even within the innovation process, because you are moving from perhaps more organic to more mechanistic processes. But organizations can also operate under what you might call simultaneous or structural ambidexterity. That is, they are pursuing activities within the organization, some with a mechanistic mode and some with an organic mode. And that might be, for example, you have an R&D department that operates in a much more organic mode, and maybe manufacturing that operates in a more mechanistic mode, or finance, for example. And these are some of the examples I talked about briefly, that you might have a shift from incremental to radical innovation, which changes the organization from perhaps being more mechanistic to more organic. You might need different functions to operate in different ways at the same time. And I mentioned R&D and finance and accounting. And I think the other thing to consider is that large companies with different divisions will have products and markets with different levels of maturity. So it might be that some divisions are more organic than others, simply because one division is looking after products that are delivered to a very immature market, and other divisions are looking after more mature markets where you might be focusing more on costs, and therefore it's a more mechanistic structure that's appropriate. And I gave the example of 3M that went through this sequential ambidexterity from an organic organization to a mechanistic organization, and ultimately to this simultaneous ambidexterity, where it was incorporating organic modes in its R&D, but mechanistic modes in other places. So you might want to revisit that. The fifth topic that I want to just refer you to very briefly is the innovation process. And I talked through the various stages of the innovation process, which is sometimes called the NPD, or New Product Development Process. And if you're talking about services, the NSD, which is the New Service Development Process. And I talked about the different stages, and I talked about different aspects of what might be referred to as the project management perspective, which is focusing on the different stages. And I said it was useful for thinking about project selection, how you might allocate and limit resources. It makes you think about stage gates and post-project evaluation. So I won't go into all the detail there, but I talked a bit about that what you might call project management stages and the project management perspective. And then I gave a bit of a critique of that. I talked about how that sort of simple stage model wasn't really giving you the full picture and wasn't always appropriate for different types of products and context. And for example, it was what I talked about. It was that stage model really is really an idealized model and perhaps an over-rational model of what went on, particularly what goes on in service companies, which are typically much more ad hoc in their service development as opposed to product companies in their product development process. But I actually also talked about innovation being a very iterative, complex and messy process, and not actually quite as linear as would be portrayed by that stage model process, and that often innovation was more of a journey. And I also talked a bit about the innovation process being a social process because of the way that people interact, and the fact that knowledge is often tacit and distributed organizations, and about boundary spanning. I also talked about it being a political process because of the limited resources and the way that decisions had to be made about the distribution of those resources to different ideas, and you have to select between ideas. And the fact that knowledge is power and knowledge is contestable, these all make innovation a political process as well, rather than just simply a process of managing stages and the like. And I also talked briefly about innovation being an emotional process, so that learning and innovation includes excitement, disappointment, fear, anxiety, and this is something that has to be managed. So in that area of that unit, I talked about the innovation process. I diverted away from the mainstream that tends to focus simply on the stages of the innovation process, and also talked about the innovation being this social, political, emotional dimension process, which managers also have to think about, not just simply the stages and the resources. And one thing I talked a little bit about was this distinction between the new product and the new service development process, and how this new product development process and the more structured process doesn't work particularly well with services. And I talked a little bit about the example from the Bank of America, which we won't go into now. The sixth topic, which I'll briefly mention, is the role of the user in the innovation process. As you recall in Unit 4, I talked about the importance of external sources, and in particular the role of users, and you can see that from the lecture that users have all sorts of important contributions to do with identifying needs, testing prototypes, giving feedback on those prototypes or final models, and perhaps using and adapting and helping the adaptation of those products and services. And there are all sorts of ways that I mentioned that users can be connected with, for example, social media. Another concept I mentioned in relation to users was lead users, and I mentioned that if you ask most users what they want, they'll say something which is pretty similar to what they've got now. And so what we want is, when we're trying to think about developing innovative products and services, we need to think about which users we're asking. And the idea of the lead user concept was thinking about users that are representative of the wider user community, but have needs ahead of those. So they're thinking ahead of your typical user, but nevertheless are representative. So they're typically innovative and are more demanding. and I gave the example of British Airways and Boeing. So that's one aspect, but I also went on to talk about actually users aren't just contributors to the innovation process. They're also can often be co-developers, and I mentioned the example of users co-developing the carry more rucksacks, so users can often be involved in the development team. And there are plenty of examples of users going on to be innovators and entrepreneurs, particularly in sports and those sorts of activities. And I made the distinction between user-dominated and supplier-dominated innovation, and in particular relating to the user. I talked about why users were, in some sectors, key innovators. And the reason is in certain sectors, such as sport, for example, the user is the one that benefits more than the manufacturer often. For example, in snowboarding, if the user can modify their board, it might help them win a gold medal, for example, or win a competition. So quite often the benefit of the innovation often resides with users in certain sectors. The knowledge and expertise, for example, about snowboarding, or in the example of Lewis Hamilton, the driving wheel, steering wheel, and the use of that steering wheel at high speed is an expertise Hamilton has over and above his own engineers. So what we find is that in certain sectors, the benefits and the knowledge actually reside with the user rather than the manufacturer. And it might be knowledge that's what's sometimes called sticky, i.e. it's knowledge that's difficult to express. And it might be therefore it's easier for the user to try and make those innovations and developments themselves. And the final topic I wanted to talk about was open versus closed innovation, again in Unit 4, again linked to where ideas come from. And the idea of open innovation versus closed innovation is open innovation is a model that sees the boundaries of the organization as being more porous. And the idea of the open innovation, which is a concept that emerged I guess about 15, 20 years ago, and to a certain extent is a repackaging of things that we've known for many years, and to a certain extent is a straw man, because actually very few companies are operating under closed innovation. But putting those thoughts aside, open innovation then is a model that is about how organizations might see their boundaries as being much more porous. So they may think that their ideas don't have to come from within their own organization. They may look outside of their organization to take ideas to help them innovate. But where ideas have been developed in-house, they might actually be quite comfortable with people externally exploiting those ideas if they are not able to. And I'll give an example of that in a minute. So an open innovation model is one that where innovations and ideas within an organization may be exploited within or outside of that organization. So an idea that emerges from outside of the organization might be located and developed by the organization, and an idea that emerges from within an organization might ultimately be developed outside of the organization. And closed innovation is a model which actually is about a company believing that they can be self-reliant and close the boundary of the organization and generate and develop their ideas in-house. And you often have linked to these two modes of innovation two different sets of principles. So with the closed innovation approach, the belief would be that you have all the smart people working for you, and therefore you don't need to look outside the organization. And this is quite distinct from the principles that underlie organizations that have a more open innovation approach. They believe that ideas are very distributed, that it's fine to take those ideas from smart people who may be from within or outside of the organization, that you don't have to be the one that exploits all of the ideas that you've created, and there may be different models which you can benefit from that. So those are sort of principles that you might want to look at, and we I showed this graphically as well, and I provided a couple of examples. So with the Environment Agency, where I've done some work, they are clearly working with partners in their flood defence technologies. So they are innovating with and through their partners. But they're also, for example, in relation to flood apps, they have a lot of data. They don't have, the Environment Agency collates this data, but they don't actually have the resource or the inclination or the skills necessarily to develop the apps that allow them this data to be provided to citizens like you and I. So they've provided the data to third parties, and these third parties, which are often small entrepreneurial companies, have created apps that use this data alongside, I guess, Google data that allows you to locate flood warnings and flood alerts. This is in the UK, by the way. Okay, I'm going to stop there. So what I've done is given you just a very quick overview of the format of the exam, and then a very quick overview of 7 different topics or themes within the innovation units that you might want to take a look at prior to the exam on July the 17th to 20th. Nicola's also going to give a short presentation which we'll upload this morning, and that will be covering units 5, 6 and 7 on operations management. If you have any other queries, you're welcome to post them on Blackboard, and I and Nicola will try and get back to you as soon as we can. And if I don't hear from you before then, good luck on the exam.